Two volunteers stood at the intake desk of the Cutback County Animal Shelter, watching a truck park crooked across two spaces, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was nothing yet worth saying. The truck was old enough that its paint had gone the color of a dry creek bed. The man who climbed out of it moved like a man who had made peace with gravity a long time ago, and no longer argued with it. Before he says a word about wanting to adopt anything, the old man asks the intake clerk for 6 days of paperwork by exact date, and nobody in the room understands why paperwork matters more to him than the dog does. 6 days was what the shelter had left. The county had posted the closure notice on the front door in a plastic sleeve, and under the notice, in smaller print, sat the name of the transport contractor 2 counties over who would receive on the 7th day every animal without an approved adopter of record. 41 animals were on that list. One of them was a decorated Belgian Malinois named Birch, 11 years old, who had not permitted a human hand to touch him in 14 months, and whose kennel card had been flagged in red for 8 of those months as a case the shelter did not expect to place. "He's asking for the log," the younger volunteer said, low to the older one. "The day by day, not the dog file, the log." "Maybe he's lost," the older one said, though she did not believe it, because men who were lost did not walk in already knowing which drawer the logs were kept in. If you've ever watched someone give up on a good animal too fast, you already know what's coming. He wore a canvas coat the color of a county fair auction ribbon gone to rust, buttoned over a collared shirt closed to the throat, despite the morning already carrying heat off the orchard rows outside. He did not look at the kennel hallway, though the barking down it was loud enough to rattle the intake window in its frame. He looked at the clerk, and he asked his question again, patiently, as though patience cost him nothing, though anyone watching his left shoulder would have seen that it sat lower than the right, and did not rise when he lifted his arm to set his hat on the counter. The clerk did not know what to do with a man who wanted paperwork before he wanted the dog. Every other adopter who had come through that door in the last 6 days had wanted the reverse: a good story, a wagging tail, something to feel good about on the drive home. This one wanted dates. He wanted, specifically, the 6 days prior to a bite incident logged against Kennel Run 14, and he wanted to know who had been on shift, and he wanted it written down, not summarized. "Sir," the clerk said, because that was the word the front desk used on anyone over 60, "we're closing in less than a week. If you're here about a dog, I can walk you back." "I know when you're closing," he said. "That's why I'm asking about dates instead of dogs. A dog doesn't need me to hurry. A record does." Neither volunteer understood the sentence, and neither of them forgot it, and that was the shape of the morning before anyone in the building had learned his name, before Regina Northcott had come out from the back office with her red marker still uncapped, before Simone Kirkendall, 6 months into the job and the only person on staff who had kept her own private notes on Kennel Run 14, looked up from the far end of the hallway and saw an old man in a rust-colored coat standing very still at a desk, asking for paper instead of a dog, and felt something she could not yet name settle low in her chest like a held breath she hadn't decided to take. 3 hours earlier and 11 miles out, past the county road where the orchard rows gave way to scrub pasture, Elwood Satterfield was already awake and already working, because the bees did not know or care what day the shelter closed. He moved down the row of boxes in the gray hour before full light, lifting each lid with his right hand, always his right, bracing the frame with a forearm rather than reaching the left arm up past the height it would go. Smoke first, low and patient, then the inspection, hive by hive, the same order every morning for 11 years since he'd set the last box down and decided that was enough boxes for one old man to keep. Inside the house, before the bees, there had been the ledger. It sat where it had always sat, on the kitchen table under the window, a hand-sewn book with a cover gone soft and dark at the corners from handling. Bernice had started it 30 years back. A column for the dog's name, a column for what ailed it, a column for what he'd done about it, because half the county had known that Elwood Satterfield would look at a limping hound or a torn ear for nothing more than a thank you and maybe a jar of honey. She had kept the book in her own hand until the year she got too tired to hold a pen steady, and after that, he had kept it in his, because closing the book felt like something he would rather die than do while she was still breathing, and after she wasn't, he kept doing it anyway. 9 years now. He still logs the dogs he treats in her ledger, in her column, in his own hand, because closing the book felt like the second funeral, and he had already been to one of those. This morning's entry was blank so far. He'd left it blank on purpose. He did not like to write a name into her book until he knew for certain the dog was his to write about. In the mudroom, hanging from a nail he'd driven himself sometime in the Johnson administration, was a canvas tool roll gone slick and soft with age, the kind a man used to carry saddle punches and awls in before there was a hardware store within 30 miles. He unrolled it now on the bench, checked the buckle, ran his thumb along the stitching of the muzzle guard, and led inside it. His own work, cut to his own pattern, sewn tight in a tension no machine had ever quite matched, because no machine had ever needed to hold what his hands remembered holding. He had made it 30-some years ago for a dog whose name he did not say out loud anymore. He rolled it back up, tucked it under his arm along with a thermos Bernice would have filled if she still could, and went out to the truck. He did not know the dog's name yet. He knew only what a neighbor's daughter, who worked 2 shifts a week at the shelter, had told him over a fence line about a Malinois nobody could touch and a closure date coming like weather. That had been enough. Some things a man does not need a name to go and stand in front of. Regina Northcott had 41 case files stacked by priority on a wall-mounted printed run sheet, updated fresh in red marker every morning, and by the time Elwood Satterfield reached the counter she had already closed 9 of them before 10 o'clock, which was the kind of morning that either broke a person or proved what they were made of. She had spent the last 2 weeks doing the arithmetic of an entire county's neglect in 6 days. Which animals had families who might still come, which had none, which could be placed by phone call alone, which would need a face-to-face and a signature. She was 34 years old and had run 3 prior shelter transitions in 2 other counties without a single animal lost to a paperwork failure. And she said so, once plainly, to a state auditor on a call that morning. And it was true. She was good at this. The evidence of it was on the wall in red ink. Case after case closed clean. She came out from the back when the front desk radioed that a man was holding up the line asking questions instead of filling out forms, and she found him standing at the counter in a coat the color of a fair ribbon, hat already off and resting crown down beside his elbow, still waiting on his 6 days of dates. "I can get you an application," she said, "but I want to save you some time. What are you here for?" "Kennel Run 14, he said. "The Malinois." Something crossed her face that was not unkindness exactly, more the flat recognition of a case she'd already logged as a lost cause weeks ago. "That dog's been flagged non-releasable since March. Bite history, behavioral hold. He's not a 14-day dog, sir. He's a 14-month dog, and in this county that usually means the file closes itself." She said the word closes the way she said it about everything. A case closed rather than decided. And around the desk 2 kennel staff who had been pretending to restock the flyer rack went a little quieter, listening now without appearing to. "I'd like to see the file," Elwood said. "You'd need to qualify for adoption first, and your property's going to be a problem before we get anywhere near his history." She turned the run sheet a quarter turn so he could see the red column, a habit of hers, letting the paperwork do the talking instead of her. "County adopted a new fence code 8 months back. 48 inches minimum. No exceptions on file yet for rural acreage. What have you got out there?" 3 rail wood, about waist high on me. That's 36, maybe less on the low end of a slope. That's an automatic denial, and there's no exemption process built before we close Friday, even if there were an exception to ask for. She said it without malice, the way a person reads out a measurement they did not invent and cannot argue with. Then, because the morning had made her tired and because tired people say the thing that is true and unkind at the same time, she added, not quite looking at him, "And I'll be honest with you. That dog's got years left in him if somebody does this right. County likes to see an adopter who's going to be around a good long while." Nobody in the room needed her to finish the sentence. The 2 volunteers by the flyer rack found something to study on the floor. Simone Kirkendall, coming up the hallway with a water bucket in each hand, stopped in the doorway and did not come any farther, watching the old man's face for the flinch that didn't come. "I've buried younger dogs than him," Elwood said, "and I expect to bury this one too someday, the ordinary way, in his own yard, when it's his time and not somebody else's schedule." He said it without heat, the way a man reads a weather report. "I'm not asking you to bet on my life expectancy. I'm asking to see the file." Regina capped her marker. It made a small, final sound in a room that had gone unusually quiet for a Tuesday. "I can't hand you a legal file you're not qualified to act on," she said. "I'm sorry. I know that's not the answer you drove out here for." "No," Elwood agreed. "It isn't." And he did not argue the fence, and he did not raise his voice, and he simply stood there a moment longer with his hat still resting crown down on the counter, which unsettled Regina more than an argument would have, because an argument she knew how to close. He did not ask again about the file. He asked instead if he might sit near the run. Regina looked at him the way a person looks at a request that isn't on any form she's ever processed. "Sit near him. Outside the gate, I won't touch the latch. I'd need a supervisor's sign-off for visitor access to a behavioral hold," she said, already half turning back toward the office, testing him, though she would not have called it that. "That's not something I do on my own authority during a closure week." "Then get the sign-off," Elwood said. "I'll wait." She got it in 11 minutes, mostly because refusing outright would have meant explaining to her own supervisor why she'd turned away a quiet old man for wanting to sit on a floor, and that was not a conversation she wanted logged anywhere near an audit. When she came back, she set a clipboard-free single sheet in front of him instead, a liability waiver, county boilerplate, absolving the shelter of responsibility for any injury sustained during unsupervised proximity to a flagged animal. "You understand what you're signing," she said. It wasn't really a question. "I've signed worse for less," he said, and signed it in a hand that did not shake, in ink, in full, first name and last, the pen held low in his fingers rather than gripped high the way younger hands held pens now. 20 minutes, Regina said. "That's the visit window during closure week. I've got 40 other cases and I can't have every visitor camped in the hallway." 20 minutes, Elwood repeated, not as agreement exactly, just as a fact he was noting down somewhere private. Simone walked him back. She was 6 months into the job, young enough that the older staff still corrected her handling technique twice a shift, but she was also the only person on the payroll who had, on her own time, kept a private notebook of exactly what Kennel Run 14 did on which day. The mornings he ate, the mornings he didn't. The one time in October he'd let a broom handle rest against the chain link without lunging. She watched Elwood's boots on the concrete as they walked, the way he set each foot down deliberate and even, no hurry in it, and she watched him approach the run itself from the dog's left side rather than head on, which was not something any training manual she'd read had ever told her to notice, and yet she noticed it. He stood at the gate a long moment without speaking, without crouching, without doing any of the things people did when they wanted a dog to like them. Birch was in the far corner of the run, low to the concrete, ears not quite flat but not up either, watching the new shape at the gate the way he watched every new shape, which was to say, waiting for it to prove itself a threat so he could be right about the world one more time. "You're not going to talk to him," Simone said, half a question. "Not yet," Elwood said. "Talking's for later if there is a later." He set his hat down on the bench outside the run, crown down again, the same gesture he'd made at the front counter, and Simone found herself cataloging it the way she'd cataloged Birch's habits, because some part of her had already decided this man was worth a private log too. His 20 minutes started, and he had not yet sat down. He unlaced his boots first, right hand doing the work on both, setting them side by side outside the gate the way a man leaves his shoes at a threshold he means to respect. Then he opened the latch, one motion, no hesitation that would read to the dog as decision-making, and stepped inside the run in his sock feet on cold concrete. He did not go to the doorframe and drop by his knees. He turned his body a quarter to the left, braced his good shoulder against the frame's edge, and lowered himself down it in stages. A hand flat on the frame, weight shifted, the bad shoulder held close and low the whole way, until he was sitting on the concrete with his back against the chain link and his legs out in front of him, unhurried, the whole descent taking longer than most men would have tolerated being watched taking it. Birch did not move from the corner. Elwood did not look at him directly. He looked instead at a middle point on the far wall, the way a man looks at nothing in particular, and he slowed his breathing into a long 4 count in, a longer count out, the kind of breath that changes a body's whole weight before it changes anything else. He did not speak. He did not extend a hand. He rested both palms flat on his own knees and let his shoulders drop half an inch, and he held that shape, patient as a fence post, for 1 minute, and then 5, and then longer than Simone had a name for. Regina came through mid-walkthrough at the 22-minute mark, past his window, though nobody had the heart to say so, clipboard-free run sheet in hand, already composing the sentence about visit limits, and stopped 3 feet short of the gate because Birch had left the corner. He had not been called. He had not been offered anything. He crossed the run low and slow, the same wary economy of motion he used for everything, and he lay down along Elwood's outstretched shin, his ribs against the old man's ankle, his head resting where a hand would have gone if a hand had been offered, which it had not. 40 minutes had passed since Elwood sat down. Nobody in the hallway had said a word for the last 10 of them. Regina Northcott stood with the run sheet against her chest and did not update anything on it. "That dog," she said finally, quiet, more to herself than to either of them, "has not let a human within 4 feet of him since March." "He's not letting me near him," Elwood said, without turning his head, his voice pitched as low and even as his breathing had been. "He's deciding I'm not a threat worth spending himself on. That's a different thing than trust. Trust comes later, if it comes." Simone had her notebook out before she decided to take it out, writing the time down without being asked to, because some part of her understood already that this was the first entry in Kennel Run 14's file in 14 months that anyone would ever want to read twice. Regina watched a long moment more, then did something that cost her something to do. She said nothing at all, and let the silence stand as the only report she was willing to make, until she understood what she'd just seen. Regina Northcott recovered her voice before she recovered her composure, which showed in the way she set the run sheet down on the bench, rather than continuing to hold it against her chest like a shield. "I'm not going to pretend that wasn't something," she said. "I've had trainers in here with treat pouches and clickers who couldn't get him off that back wall. I watched a behaviorist give up on him in April." She looked at Elwood, still seated on the concrete with 11 years of shelter-hardened dog breathing slow against his shin. "But what I watched doesn't change what's on paper, and paper's what's going to move him out that gate Friday or not." "I understand paper," Elwood said. "Then you understand the fence code doesn't have an exception process. I checked again this morning before you got here, hoping I was wrong. There's no rural variance on file, no waiver process the county's built. Nothing I can point to and say here, sign this, you're approved. If it's not built, I can't build it in 6 days. For now." "And the bite," Elwood said. Not a question. He knew there'd be one on a dog like this. There was always a reason typed into a file that made refusal easier than explanation. Regina exhaled through her nose, the closest she'd come all morning to looking tired in front of a stranger. March 14th. A processing incident. A handler needed 4 stitches. It's in the file as an unprovoked bite during restraint, and legally that closes the door regardless of what I just watched with my own eyes. County liability doesn't care how sweet a dog got in the last 40 minutes. It cares what's typed. Simone had been standing at the edge of the run with her notebook still open, and now she stepped forward, and something in her posture said she had been waiting weeks for someone in the building to ask her the right question instead of the convenient one. "I have 5 months of daily notes on him," she said. "Feeding, handling, every incident, every non-incident. It's not just today. I've got March 14th documented from my own shift log, not the official one." Regina's expression did something complicated, unease arriving a half-beat behind curiosity. "You kept a private log." "Nobody asked me not to." "Nobody asked you to either, which is the problem." Regina rubbed at her temple, the red marker still capped in her other hand, forgotten. "Simone, I want to believe you, but a personal notebook isn't an official record. If I try to enter that into a case file 4 days before a state audit closes this county's entire shelter transition, it doesn't help him. It flags the whole file for review, and review takes longer than 4 days. I'd need a supervisor to authorize a late record amendment, and my supervisor is at a conference in the state capitol until Thursday night. Your log might be the truest thing in this building, and it still can't move a single form before Friday." The silence that followed did not feel like the silence in the run. That one had felt like something arriving. This one felt like a door closing on a hinge nobody had oiled in years, and everybody standing in the hallway heard the same complaint in it. That decency and procedure had stopped being the same animal a long time before any of them had gotten here. Elwood shifted his weight, one hand finding the doorframe again, and began the slow climb back up out of the run the same way he'd gone down it, in stages, the dog rising with him and staying pressed to his leg the whole way, as though the shin had become something worth guarding. March 14th, Elwood said again, once he was standing, once his boots were back on his feet and laced by his own patient hand. Who was on shift? Regina blinked. I'd have to look. Look, he said. Not a demand. A plain request, spoken the way a man asks for a specific bolt size, certain the drawer holding it exists somewhere in the building. She went and got the shift roster instead of answering, because it was easier to move than to keep standing in a hallway that had gone strange on her. And while she was gone, Simone crouched at the gate, notebook against her knee, and said quietly to Elwood, "You knew there'd be a date before she said one." "There's always a date," Elwood said. "Man doesn't turn out unadoptable in 14 months for no reason. Somewhere there's a piece of paper that made him that way, and paper's got a date on it same as anything." He looked down at Birch, who had not moved from beside him, even standing. "Dog's not born wrong. Dog gets made wrong, or made to look it, one entry at a time." Regina came back with the roster, and this time her voice had lost most of the crispness it had carried at the front counter that morning. March 14th, she read. Intake and processing, Kennel Run 14. Handler on shift reported a bite requiring first aid. She stopped. Read it again. That's not right. What's not right? Simone said. The bite report lists Kennel Run 14, Regina said slowly, but the handler's own incident narrative. I'm reading it now. I don't know why I never cross-checked the run number against the narrative before. We log by run number as a shorthand, and I signed off on the shorthand. The narrative describes a dog held for a rabies booster that had already been sedated for a dental procedure that same morning. Birch wasn't sedated in March. His medical files clean that whole month. Run 15 had a sedation and a dental on the 14th. Run 14 didn't have anything logged that day except a routine weigh-in. She looked up, and for the first time all morning, she looked less like a woman running 41 cases and more like a woman staring at her own signature at the bottom of a page she should have read twice. I co-signed this. I signed off on the shorthand every week for 8 months and never once pulled the narrative to check it against the run number. Which means, Simone said, quiet, careful, watching Regina's face rather than the page. The bite's real. It happened. It's just not his. It's 15's, Regina said. It was always 15's. Nobody in the hallway said anything for a moment that stretched longer than the 22 minutes Elwood had already overstayed. Then the front desk buzzer sounded, and one of the volunteers came around the corner looking flustered in a way that had nothing to do with dogs. There's a car out front, she said. Older gentleman, says he's a colonel, says somebody called him about a marine dog case, and Regina, he's already halfway up the walk. Colonel Tobias Renfro came through the shelter's front door, the way a man comes into a room he has decided, on the drive over, to treat gently regardless of what he finds in it. He was 66, silver-headed, still carrying himself with the economy of a man who had once measured his own posture against younger officers and had no need to prove anything to a county building now. Simone had made the call 2 hours earlier, quietly, from the break room, dialing a number the shelter's Veterans Outreach flyer had listed for a regional foundation board, saying only that there was a decorated K-9 named Birch about to be lost to a paperwork error and that she didn't know who else to tell. He stopped 3 steps into the hallway. He looked at the man standing by Kennel Run 14, in a rust-colored coat with his hat crowned down on the bench, and something crossed his face that had nothing to do with the dog at all. Satterfield, he said. Just the name. Nothing after it. Elwood turned, unhurried, the same quarter turn he used for everything. Colonel. It's been 31 years, Renfro said, and did not move any closer yet, as though the distance itself were something he needed a moment to cross honestly. Regina looked between them, the corrected shorthand still in her hand, forgotten now. You two know each other. He trained under my doctrine review board in the years I ran canine procurement, Renfro said, still looking at Elwood, and I trained under his stubbornness, which turned out to be the better education. He came forward at last, slower than a man his age needed to move, and stopped in front of Elwood, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which seemed to Simone the loudest silence she had heard all week. "I heard there was a Malinois in trouble," Renfro said, "and a call from a young woman who didn't know my name, but knew the Foundation's number. I did not expect to find you standing next to him." "Wasn't planning on being found," Elwood said. "Wasn't hiding either." Renfro's gaze dropped briefly to Elwood's left shoulder, the one that would not rise past chest height, and something moved through his jaw that he did not try to hide. "I signed his commendation," he said, turning now to look through the chain link at Birch, who had come to stand at the gate as if he, too, recognized the register of a voice used to giving orders. "2 confirmed fines and a structural collapse 3 years ago. Different handler than the one standing in front of me now. I signed the paper that called him exceptional. I did not sign the paper that let him rot in a county kennel for 14 months after his handler lost his housing." He looked at Regina. "Whose desk was that?" "Mine, eventually," Regina said, and did not flinch from saying it. "Then you and I will talk," Renfro said, not unkindly. "But first, I owe this man something older than your file." Regina Northcott sat down on the bench outside Kennel Run 14 because standing had stopped feeling like the right posture for what she was watching, and she was not the one it was happening to. Colonel Renfro had not sat. He stood in front of Elwood with the particular stiffness of a man deciding whether his knees would forgive him for what he was about to do. And then he did it anyway. He lowered himself onto the bench beside Regina, harder than he meant to, a controlled drop rather than a seated ease, and put both hands on his own knees the way Elwood had put his hands on his in the run 40 minutes before. 31 years, he said again, and I never once wrote you a letter because every letter I drafted sounded like an apology, and I didn't know how to apologize to a man who never let me carry the weight I owed him." "Wasn't yours to carry," Elwood said. "Doctrine board wanted somebody's head for pushing the decompression method over the correction collar method. Wasn't going to be yours. You had a family and a career worth keeping. I had neither at the time that I couldn't afford to lose." "You had a wife," Renfro said, quiet now. "I had Bernice," Elwood agreed, and said nothing further about her, which told the room more than a sentence would have. "You took the reprimand," Renfro said, to Regina now, to Simone, to the 2 volunteers who had drifted back down the hallway and were pretending, badly, to restock a flyer rack they'd already restocked twice that morning, "so that I could keep my commission and push the method through anyway, under my name, after you'd already been punished for proposing it. It's been Marine Corps doctrine for 30 years because of a method he built and a black mark he wore, so I wouldn't have to." He turned to the run, to Birch, who stood with his shoulder against the gate as though he understood he was the subject of the sentence being spoken over him. "Decompression before correction. Let the animal choose its own distance and its own pace back toward contact. Breathe low, sit low, don't reach." He recited it without looking down at any paper, each phrase landing in the exact order Elwood had taught it, word for word. The way a man recites something he has said to himself in the dark more than once over 3 decades. I know the doctrine because I approved it under my own signature. I did not know until 40 minutes ago that I was watching the man who actually wrote it sit on a concrete floor to save the last dog anyone in this county was willing to give up on. Regina had gone very quiet beside him, the corrected shift roster still folded in her hand. When she finally spoke, her voice had none of the crispness of the morning left in it. "I closed his case in March," she said. Not to Renfro, to Elwood, because it seemed to matter to her that he be the one she said it to. "I co-signed a shorthand I never checked against the narrative, and it put a dog 3 days from euthanasia for something that happened 2 runs down the hall. I've been running this closure like an audit I needed to survive, and I never once asked whether the paper I was moving was telling the truth." She looked at the run sheet on the bench, 41 names in red marker, and something in the set of her shoulders shifted, the way a person's does when a job stops being a schedule and starts being a set of lives again. "I'm not going to just fix his file," she said. "I'm going to pull all 40 others before Friday and read every narrative against every shorthand myself. If I made this mistake once because I trusted my own system too much, I've probably made it more than once." "That's the only apology that's worth anything," Elwood said. "Not the words, the rechecking." Renfro looked at him a long moment, and something passed between the two old men that neither Simone nor Regina were meant to fully understand. A private ledger of its own being settled without a word spent on it. "What do you want?" Renfro asked finally. "Name it. I have standing on that foundation board, and I will use every ounce of it before I leave this building." "I don't want your standing," Elwood said. "I came for the dog, and it looks like I'm getting the dog, fence or no fence, now that the file's been read right. What I want is smaller than that." He looked at Simone, who had gone very still with her notebook against her chest, waiting to hear whether the last 5 months of unpaid, unasked for attention were about to matter to anyone but her. Her notes. Make them part of the intake procedure going forward, not just for him. For every dog that can't tell you himself what happened to him, somebody ought to be writing it down whether or not the county tells them to, and somebody ought to be reading it when they do. Regina looked at Simone for a long moment, and then nodded, once, the kind of nod that carries more weight than a signature. "Starting today," she said. "It'll need a second signature line on the intake form. I'll draft it myself before I leave tonight." Elwood picked his hat up off the bench, settled it on his head, and looked down at Birch through the chain link one more time, unhurried, the way he looked at everything. "Then I believe we're square," he said, to no one in particular and to everyone in the hallway at once. 6 weeks later, the porch light at Elwood Satterfield's place came on before full dawn, the same way it always had, and a Belgian Malinois 11 years and 2 months old walked out from beside the door without a leash, without a lead, without anything but the old man's pace to match, down the 2 porch steps and along the worn dirt track toward the bee boxes at the far end of the pasture. He did not run ahead. He did not lag behind. He walked at Elwood's left side, exactly level with the hip on the shoulder that would not rise, as though he had learned, the way dogs learn everything that matters, precisely where the weakness lived, and had decided without being asked to stand guard on that side of it. Inside the mudroom, on a nail driven sometime in an administration nobody remembered, the canvas tool roll still hung where it always had, and inside it, coiled and buckled, the hand-stitched lead he'd cut and sewn decades before to his own private pattern sat exactly as it had sat the morning he carried it out to the truck. He had not needed it since the day he brought Birch home. He kept it anyway, the way a man keeps a tool he built with his hands, even after the job it was built for stops needing doing. Because some objects are not about use. They are about having been ready. At the bee boxes, Elwood lifted the first lid with his right hand, and Birch settled into the grass a few feet off, not sleeping, not idle, watching the field the way he had once been trained to watch a collapsed structure for a sound only he could hear, except now there was nothing under any of this ground that needed finding, and some mornings that seemed to be the whole point of it. Back in the kitchen, later, with the coffee gone from hot to merely warm the way it always did while he worked, Elwood opened the ledger on the table under the window, the same book Bernice had started 30 years back, the same hand-sewn cover, soft and dark at the corners now, from 30 more years of use than she'd ever seen it get. He found the next open line. He wrote the date first, the way he always did, and then, in her column, in his own steady hand, he wrote the name Birch, and beside it, where the entry for what ailed the animal usually went, he wrote a single word, nothing, and beside that, where the entry for what he'd done about it usually went, he wrote, kept him. He closed the book gently, the way a man closes a door on a room he intends to keep coming back into, and set it back under the window where the morning light would find it first. At the shelter, 41 miles away, a new intake form sat clipped to a board behind the front desk, freshly printed, with a second signature line added at the bottom where none had existed 6 weeks before, and a young kennel technician's initials already filled into it more than once that week, because somebody had finally decided that the quiet, unglamorous act of writing down what an animal could not say for itself was worth an official line on an official page. Some of the best ones never bark for attention. They just wait for the one person who knows how to listen, and out past the bee boxes, in the gray hour before full light, one of them walked beside an old man's ruined shoulder, off the leash entirely, exactly where he had chosen, on his own, to stay.